Let me close by addressing the claim of some that Paul regretted having taken this approach in Athens, and so changed his appeal in Corinth. It's said that Paul's outreach in Athens was a failure, for no New Testament church was apparently ever established there. So when Paul moved on to Corinth, he supposedly abandoned the appeal to the intellect and just preached Christ. This interpretation rests upon Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 2, verses 1 to 5. When I came to you, brethren, I did not come proclaiming the mystery of God to you in lofty words or wisdom, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And I came to you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. My speech and my proclamation were not with plausible words of wisdom, but with a demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on the power of God. So the claim is that having failed in Athens, Paul abandoned an approach that appeals to the intellect and instead just preached Christ. I'm convinced that this interpretation represents a drastic misunderstanding of what Paul writes to the Corinthians. In the first place, it is predicated upon the view that Paul's outreach in Athens was a failure because it failed to establish a local church. This allegation strikes me as very unfair. Paul spent a year and a half in Corinth establishing the church, whereas he was simply passing through Athens, waiting for Silas and Timothy to join him. Moreover, Luke does not present Paul's Areopagus speech as a failure. Rather, he says that some of his audience joined with Paul and became believers. And he singles out among them Dionysius, who was himself incredibly a member of the Areopagus Council, as well as a woman named Damaris. To win a member of the Athenian city council itself, as well as others, was no small success. Whether a church was established in Athens would depend more upon the zeal and perseverance of these early believers rather than upon Paul's brief visit. But what about what Paul says in his first letter to the Corinthians? I think it's true that Paul would have regarded the worldly wisdom of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers as foolishness. I could well imagine his saying of these philosophers what he writes in 1 Corinthians 1, 20 to 25. Where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided through the foolishness of our proclamation to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom. But we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews, and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God, and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Paul would not have regarded his proclamation of Jewish monotheism in Athens as any accommodation to the wisdom of the world. Citing Greek poets to undermine the worldly wisdom of the Stoics and Epicureans in no way compromises the gospel. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 33, Paul cites the enormously popular Athenian playwright Menander in support of the point he is making. If the dead are not raised, and then here comes the quotation, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. So in the Corinthian correspondence itself, Paul is quoting these Greek playwrights. When Paul says in 1 Corinthians that he did not come to Corinth proclaiming the mystery of God in lofty words or wisdom, the point of contrast is not Paul in Athens, but Paul's detractors in Corinth. The Corinthian church was riven with divisions, and there were those in Corinth who regarded Paul as a sort of inferior apostle. To these, Paul says sarcastically in 1 Corinthians 4, "We are fools for the sake of Christ, but you are wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong." Chapter 4, verse 10. In 2 Corinthians 10:10, Paul mentions one of the criticisms of his detractors. I quote, "They say his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible." In response, Paul says, and I quote, "I think that I am not in the least inferior to these super apostles. I may be untrained in speech, but not in knowledge. Certainly, in every way and in all things, we have made this evident to you." 2 Corinthians 11, 5-6. Paul's detractors regarded him as inferior in eloquence and wisdom. Against these, Paul does not mince words. He says, "Such boasters are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ." 2 Corinthians 11:13. In saying that his proclamation of the gospel to the Corinthians was not in lofty words or wisdom, Paul is not drawing a contrast with himself in Athens, but with these pseudo-apostles in Corinth who prided themselves on their eloquence and wisdom. Paul is repudiating the values of which they boast. Thus, those who say that Paul repented of his approach in Athens are guilty of a disastrous misunderstanding of Paul. If you want to see how Paul himself thought of his approach in Athens, it is to the Thessalonian correspondence that you must turn. Recall that Paul had been driven out of Thessalonica just before being spirited off to Athens. When he moved on from Athens to Corinth, Paul wrote to those Thessalonian believers to express his relief at hearing that they had sustained their faith in the face of the persecution. His letter to the Thessalonian church are thus the earliest of Paul's epistles in the New Testament, written from Corinth around AD 50 to 51. In 1 Thessalonians 3:1, Paul mentions his being left in Athens alone, while Timothy returned to Thessalonica to see if the believers had endured the persecution. Timothy brought a glowing report to Paul in Corinth, and Paul's letter to these Thessalonian believers is full of joy. Paul's description of the message that he proclaimed in Thessalonica could just as easily been a description of the message he proclaimed in Athens. Paul says, "It is widely reported," and I quote, "how you turned to God from idols to serve a living and true God and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who rescues us from the wrath that is coming." 1 Thessalonians 9:10. Here we find the same themes of turning from pagan idolatry, the reality of the true God, the resurrection of Jesus, and the coming day of judgment. The only additional element in Thessalonians is waiting for the return of Christ, which Paul couldn't get to in Athens because he was cut off as soon as he mentioned the resurrection. Paul's proclamation in Athens represented his typical approach to a pagan audience, an approach which met with great success in Thessalonica and which he continued to endorse. In fact, writing later from Ephesus to the church in Corinth, Paul describes his philosophy of evangelism in these words: "To the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, so that I might win those outside the law. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means win some."